It's a very easy thing to what I would call today virtue politics, that I can present myself as virtuous by attacking industry, and not have to worry about the consequences of the decisions that are made.
Hello again. Welcome to another episode of The Swift Half with Snowdon, with me, Christopher Snowdon. One of the things I love about doing this show is I not only get to speak to people I admire, often people I haven't spoken to before, but also hopefully introduce people that you might not have come across before necessarily, and different perspectives. And so on that theme, I'm very happy to welcome onto the show somebody I've been following for a long time, who blogs at Risk-Monger, that's risk-monger.com. He's David Zaruk. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay, Chris, although my apologies if you see some steam coming out while I'm speaking. I haven't put the heating on in my house yet because it's just too damn expensive for energy here in Belgium.
Good, man. Well, if you see steam from me, it'll be me vaping, so don't worry. David, can you just introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Well, I'm sort of in transition. I was a professor for 17 years. Before that, I worked in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry for a company called Solvay, and then also doing some consulting work and also work at the European Chemicals Agency. Chemical Industry Association. But now I think I'm just full-time mongering, giving speeches, traveling and writing.
And I mean, you write about various different things, but one of the main themes is policy making at the EU level in particular, which is a real sausage factory, and the NGOs, and particularly the environmental NGOs, the anti-science NGOs, people trying to get herbicides and pesticides, various chemicals banned based on the precautionary principle as they describe it. You've been writing some very interesting stuff recently. You've done a series of posts about what you call the tobacconization of industry in general, and how all sorts of different industries are being shoved out of the policy making process, being demonized and so on. You're not too keen on all the taught lawyers and people making money out of scare stories such as Glyphosate, Roundup, and so on. So I don't know how you have the patience, to be honest with you, to deal with these people, because you're hugely outnumbered there in Brussels, almost a lone voice speaking out against these people. And you also been saying that you think the industry's been quite weak in standing its ground. I don't know where to start. Should we start with Roundup, with Glyphosate? Because this is a product that, if people don't know much about it, they probably just think it's bad and it causes cancer and so on. So what was the story with this? Because it's kind of a miracle product, right? Roundup, it basically kills everything but the one thing you want to keep alive in the field.
Yeah, in fact, they call it the herbicide of the century, because you have to understand that it is a very benign chemical. It's part of what goes in. Well, glyphosate goes into different formulations as a herbicide to kill weeds. And it was introduced in the 1970s. I grew up on a farm in the 1970s. And of course, I was, as a child, one of those that had to sit in the hot sun and pull weeds all the time. So I think we have to understand what it actually did to farming and what it did to increasing yields and reducing the labor costs on farms. So it was extremely successful. And you can drink it. There's no reason to, obviously, but it is safe. It breaks down in the soil, so it's also environmentally very benign. But it does one thing that just drives the NGOs crazy. It makes GMOs, particularly types of Roundup Ready or herbicide tolerant maize and soy. It works together so that farmers can spray after the seeds start coming up and be able to keep a good harvest with limited intervention on the soil. So it justifies or legitimizes genetically modified organisms being grown. And so in order to stop GMOs, since GMOs don't kill people, the NGOs have focused for the last 5 years on the agent that sort of justifies or makes it economically viable, and that's Roundup. Originally manufactured as a brand by Monsanto, it became quite an attractive target for the NGOs. You attack Monsanto, you delegitimize the source, and you create public outrage. And the fact that you don't have any science, or you get tort lawyers to pay some scientists to go to IARC to produce a document that says it's a carcinogen, and you print money.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened.
And in California, there was some lawsuits a few years ago, right? And I mean, basically every scientific agency has shown that glyphosate is safe, except for IARD, the international, what's it called? International Agency on
Research on Cancer. Yeah.
Research on Cancer. And you know, as often happens in America, like ridiculous sums of money being demanded. I don't know if it went to appeal and was reduced. That's usually the way it goes. But there was, I think, one guy who claimed to basically got cancer as a result of being exposed to glyphosate, I think.
And it's sometimes it's hard to explain, because the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma can be caused by thousands of different exposures, and I don't want to belittle any claims and such, but the amount of advertising that the law firms basically did is in the hundreds of millions, and they had over 100,000 cases. The first few cases were victorious for the lawyers, but the last 7 that have gone on against Bayer now, which the company that bought Monsanto, have ruled in Bayer's favor. So you can't continually win on outrage alone. And I think that's one of the points, that the scientific evidence is not there. You can pay a retired scientist $450 an hour, and they'll do what, whatever you want them to do, and they'll say, the science is not certain on this case, or we're not exactly clear what causes the cancer. And with that, a jury of generalists will listen to the emotional arguments about some evil industry making millions in profits and not caring about the public. And the lawyers take more than 50% of the money. Another 25% go to the rather curious financial arms that are funding the law firms. And whatever's left will go to the victims, which is usually quite small, if anything at all.
Yeah. I didn't know you grew up on a farm. I grew up on a farm as well. And so my dad's and my brothers are both farmers. And I still hear, particularly from my dad, about the various threats to various very important products, and the EU in particular banning anything that works, but pretty much. The other one, the neonicotinoids, which again, people don't really know about, other than they think that they kill lots of bees. I think people assume it's a spray. It's not actually a spray, as I understand it. It's a sealant, right, for the seeds. You basically paint the seed with it and it goes into the ground. So it never goes into the air or anything like that. But a very similar story with that. And the EU has actually banned those, I think. Is that right?
Yes, there are different types of neonics, as it's easy, because neonicotinoid is a rather hard thing to say, but it's a nicotine-based, in this case, insecticide. And by treating the seeds rather than spraying it, what's called a foliar application, you reduce the use of insecticides, which means you also reduce the runoff into the water. And as it's systemic, it will only affect the insects that will eat into the plant. So, for example, these wonderful fields of yellow that we would see on our landscapes, which is oilseed rape, or in North America it's called canola. They have particular predators that will get in at a very early stage and destroy the plant before the farmer can even see it. And so they work very effectively and very economically and in a very environmentally benign way. Now, there was a decline in bee populations, particularly honeybee populations, around 10 years ago. Of course, when you have a decline in pollinators, there's something wrong with the system. What's causing it? Well, it could be many things. It could be climate change. It could be diesel exhaust fumes. It could be different urbanization that's destroying a lot of the natural habitats for the bees. But it could also be pesticides. And of course, the NGOs, if they are going to choose their poison, they will choose pesticides as the cause of this. But there was no direct link to say that the honeybees were actually, as I say, going extinct, which they weren't. Because of contact with pollen that is coming out of these flowering crops. So, but it worked well, this campaign that if we lose the bees, I don't think Einstein actually said it, but if we lose the bees, humanity will also go extinct. So you've got a good Armageddon, theory in this case. Evil industry making lots of profits, and industrial agriculture making sure that in this case, the bees will die. So the precautionary principle was applied because you could not prove that it was not the neonics. So in an abundance of precaution, they banned it quite quickly as a political agreement with the French government at the time. Okay, so farmers, particularly in certain areas, that are more prone to these types of mites that will destroy particularly oilseed rape, stop planting it. The UK used to be the third largest crop and a main export of oilseed rape. They're now importing it. So that's bad economically. That's also bad for the bees because these wonderful yellow flowers is one of the first things that come out in the springtime. And so it's an important source of pollen as the bees are emerging from their wintering. And so they've removed a major source of food for the bees. And on top of that, I believe that now scientists can say with a certain amount of certainty that it's cold winters that were responsible for a large amount of the bee dying off population. But we're not going to go back and reinstate these seed treated neonics, which is sad because actually seed treating reduced the runoff into the environment of certain pesticides and was able to be better controlled by the farmer. So it's a more precise technology than the older technologies, which we had to go back to using, like perithrins, which, by the way, can be produced organically as well, and is produced organically in countries like Rwanda, where the military has taken over and has increased the growth of chrysanthemum flowers, and a lot of women and child labor is brought into this case so that we can be able to produce an organic approved alternative to neonics. Isn't that sweet?
And I mean, obviously not every government has banned neonics. I guess they're legal in America, are they? Have they seen this big drop off in bee pop? No, it's not legal in America.
No, the Obama administration at the time did set up a research commission to report back because after the European precautionary ban, and they said there's no problem.
Okay. And what was the story with Anne Glover? She was the first and only chief scientific advisor, was it, to the European Commission?
Yes. In fact, this is actually I'd have to say one of the big tragedies for Brussels. There was a decision to introduce a chief scientific advisor to the president of the European Commission. So in this case, that would be Ursula von der Leyen. And it would just be someone with a small office of 3 or 4 people who could watch the different debates going on and be able to be the sort of scientist in the room who can give advice when needed. As Churchill said, scientists should be on tap, not on top. And of course, if there is a study that comes out that shows, terrible losses of bee populations due to, neonics, someone like Anne Glover could go through the documents and look at the quality of the research, look at the quality of the organizations, and advise the president of the commission and his cabinet or her cabinet on the best form of action. So it was an extremely useful, very low cost way to ensure that you would have good governance and rational policy. Now, she was rather outspoken, though, about GMOs, and quite simply said, you're entitled to your opinion, and you can choose your opinion, but you can't choose your facts, a rather famous expression. And she was standing up to a lot of the NGO anti-GMO campaigns. And so a certain group, I think around 10 NGOs, environmental NGOs, led by this really nasty group of hyenas called Corporate Europe Observatory, decided that it was time to remove that post. And they petitioned in a very hard way. They lobbied the then president of the commission to remove Anne Glover's post and replace it with a rather quiet scientific board, which didn't really exist in any sort of, it was called on virtually when needed. And so the voice of science had been silenced within the European Commission, at which point we've seen what's happened since the Green Deal.
Yeah, right. So I mean, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it, that you've got a small group of NGOs forcing out a respected scientist because they don't like what she's saying, because she's right about the science and they're wrong. How do they get so much influence and power, these organizations?
They're loud. They're loud. They're aggressive. Nobody likes them shouting outside their window or throwing paint on their doors. It's also if you're not accountable, then you can easily make the problems go away. Let's give them money. Or let's do something. Let's direct them towards people we don't like in particular. So we'll fund these NGOs to do campaigns that are sort of in the interests of some of our organizations. But it's also structural as well. There are quite a few people from NGOs that reach the top of their game in their mid-30s. There aren't many layers. It's not like a company where you've got different steps up the corporate ladder, and you can be up for promotion every 18 months to 2 years. So if you're in your mid-30s and you're the head of NGO, or it can be a small NGO, doesn't matter. The next step is to go into government, and you're often in contact with government people. So, and it's no problem for governments to employ people coming in from NGOs. It's a bigger problem if you work for industry, but in industry, I think you're in a better structure and a better opportunities for you in any case. So there are a lot of activists who are now working in governments. And I think the most incredible one recently was the German government decided, this is under the Green Party and Annalena Baerbock, who basically named the International Executive Director of Greenpeace, Jennifer Morgan, as the chief climate representative for the government of Germany. She's now an employee of the German government, flying around the world. She was the head of the COP27 delegation for Germany. And she's running her campaign exactly as she would when she was at Greenpeace. And it's okay.
Yeah.
Greenpeace hasn't replaced her. So I think she's just on loan. And she'll probably return after, I think she probably has to do a German proficiency exam at some point. She's an American, and then they gave her a passport. Now, I thought they only did that for football players, but maybe I'm wrong.
So it kind of seems it kind of seems extraordinary that the farming lobby doesn't win more of these battles. I mean, maybe this is naive, but it seems like the EU's main function really is to prop up European farming, right? The common agricultural policy, all the subsidies, it's the biggest part of the budget, I think. And yet you keep having fairly small, narrow groups of people essentially crippling agriculture.
Yeah.
Why does that happen?
Unfortunately, farmers themselves as a voting bloc are quite small. There's only around 12 million farmers in the EU, and that population is actually going down as the yields are coming up, which is quite unique. But what you have at this point, it's not only just demographics, but if you don't have a strong political voice, in this case, not a large movement, whereas the organic political lobby is quite large. And you have to make a decision. You will look at the path of least resistance. Now, unfortunately, farmers are also very respectful people as well. So I think in July, there was a bit of a flare up, and you can easily bring in 20 tractors into the center of Brussels and stop traffic completely. But unfortunately, farmers are also quite busy with their work. So who's actually speaking up and who's protecting them and the technologies that they need? Unfortunately, it's the chemical industry, and they don't have a lot of friends because they're industry. Who else? What other voices will stand up for agriculture? We need the prices to go up massively before people start to wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so consumer groups may start to take more of an interest, but most of the cases, you can say and do what you want against agricultural technologies, and there'll be very little voices that will have credibility. I was speaking to a group of pesticide companies, and I told them one time, just take a year off, stop selling your product and see what happens. And of course, that would go against their ethical codes of conduct, of course, and their business models. But we really have to try to change what's happening, because it's a very easy thing to what I would call today virtue politics, that I can present myself as virtuous by attacking industry, and not have to worry about the consequences of the decisions that are made. And I mean, what
was that flare up all about in July? I kind of saw bits and pieces from Belgium and Netherlands, farmers protesting. I wasn't quite sure exactly what they're protesting about, and a lot of people who were talking about it seemed to be conspiracy theorists. But it did look like a genuine protest. But I couldn't quite work out what was the cause of it.
Well, I think that the farmers are getting angrier in Europe, which is important, because I think that's a big difference with the US. In the US, you've got the angry farmer who doesn't trust anything that politicians are going to do, and they speak up at any moment. But this was in particular, in the Netherlands, it was particularly related to a decommissioning of certain farms, or taking farms out of production in order to meet their commitments to the greenhouse gas emissions. And these farms were very efficient farms, and of course there was protests that the means for farming was being slowly eroded.
What does that mean, to be decommissioned? Like literally, you ban them from farming?
It's a question whether they banned them, or they just made licensing much harder, or if they actually did take the land out of farm use as a rezoning. It's and this is where I think conspiracy theories start to confuse what actually happened. But the point was, it was a move by the government to reduce their agricultural footprint. Now, I'd rather see an efficient country like the Netherlands producing more than Austria or Switzerland, which have these wonderful bucolic images of cows with bells on them on hillsides that are not very productive, because we need sustainable intensification. We need better production and better yields from less land, and we can rewild the less productive land. But that's not going to happen under the present regimes.
So can you tell me about the farm to fork strategy, which I gather is pretty important, but a lot of people don't really know about, including myself, really?
It's part of the Green Deal. Now, the Green Deal is meant to combat climate change, and it's a legacy policy set up by Ursula von der Leyen, but essentially led by Frans Timmermans, who's a Dutch politician who really prides himself on the sort of war on capitalism. And so essentially they're going to address the impact or the footprint of farming on climate change by setting certain demands by 2030, in particular to reduce the use of pesticides by 50%. Which ones? We're not really sure, but reduce the use of certain types of fertilizers by 25%. Okay, these are synthetic, by the way. They call them chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides because somehow organic pesticides aren't chemicals. This is part of what happens when you get rid of the scientists in the room. They want a toxic-free Europe. This is what they called farm to fork as well. Toxic free, just don't get me started. So, and then on top of that, they would like to see 25% of land being used or farmed organically by 2030. At the moment in Europe, it's 4% of farmland that is organically farmed. And that's mainly in Italy, France, and Austria. And more than half of that is grassland, so not what I would call intensive agriculture. So I don't know how we're going to get from an effective 2% of farmland being farmed organically to 25%. And most scientific organizations, and including the European Commission's own Joint Research Center, said this is going to cause major losses in yield, major food production headaches, as well as global stresses on food security.
Yeah.
Then the Ukraine, and the response to the European Commission to the crisis coming up is that there was alarmism, and that we need to make sure that we have a more sustainable agriculture.
But what's the target? What's the target date for this to all happen by?
2030.
2030, 8 years time.
Yeah, well, it's 7 years and 2 months. It's a really good question. This is normal in the Commission to have aspirational goals. We talked about Vision 2020 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And these aspirational goals are nice, but the Commission has kind of confused that with regulations. And so I can't really be certain how you can introduce a regulation based on a dream. But they can do. Most countries, I think, are going to be unable to meet the goals. They'll just move the goalposts, and it won't at all be positive for the environment. In fact, it'll be quite destructive for the environment and for consumers.
For sure. I mean, if they did achieve this, roughly what would be the effect on production yields and prices, do you think?
Oh, it will go down. We will import. I mean, Europe is already a net food importer. But it will go up dramatically. Of course, if we continue to ban certain pesticides like glyphosate, we won't be able to import any animal feed. Solution's quite obvious: just stop eating meat. And so you're going to begin to see major shifts in not just prices and trade of food, but also, unfortunately, it's going to affect developing countries in a very serious way, because they will not be able to enjoy technologies. If there's a risk, they won't be able to export to the European Union. So the smallholders will continue to struggle. They'll continue to have to farm organically, which means their children will probably be pulling weeds and breaking leaves. And that's, that's tragic, but no, the precautionary principle, you're never actually responsible for the consequences. You're caring, you're making decisions in the interest of being good.
Right, nearly out of time already, I'm afraid. But the final question, I told you it would be brief. What hope is there? I mean, it sounds they're not going to achieve this target by 2030, but they're clearly going to keep moving in direction. They're going to keep banning things and making life harder for farmers and putting up the prices of food. Is there any hope of what can be done?
Well, my series that's called the Industry Complex, where I start with the whole idea that all industries being tobacconized, comes out with the main view: you've got to stand up. Industry's got to stop, bowing. I mean, industry was raising their glass to the farm to fork and the Green Deal strategies. It affects other productions and chemicals as well, and energy, without stopping and giving the European commissioners a shake. And I think the industry has to start speaking with one voice. At the moment, industry is much like the second slowest zebra. There's a lion munching on the slowest zebra today, and well, that's really too bad, but I can live for another day. Well, this tobacco industry today, tomorrow it's going to be the pesticides, the day after that, pharmaceuticals. That lion has, is very difficult to satiate. It's got an enormous appetite and will continue to attack industry. Industry's got to start restoring their sense of image, of trust with the public. It has to start taking a stronger line against stupid policies that makes the future of industry almost impossible in Europe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's kind of puzzling that they don't take a stronger line to me, but maybe there's reasons for that I don't fully understand. David, it's fantastic speaking to you. Love reading your blog and following your Twitter feed. So that's risk-monger.com, folks. If you want to go on and see what David's been writing about, keep up the good fight, the uphill battle. And thank you, folks, for watching. We'll be back in another couple of weeks. If you want to give us some money, you can do. You can donate at ia.org.uk/donate or patreon.com/IA London. If you are a donor, thanks very much. Much appreciated. You help pay for shows like this. As I say, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Another great guest. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you, David, for joining us. Goodbye.
Bye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.